This video is brought to you by Devout Decals, makers of reusable Catholic art for your home altar, your bedroom, and your home classroom.
The question often arises when talking about the people who are pushing for dramatic changes to the faith and how the church operates. The question arises, do they believe? Do they have the Catholic faith? And in most circumstances, judging such things is not the most prudent thing to be doing. But some people make it pretty obvious that they have replaced the Catholic faith with secular values, the values of the world, and then they try to impose those on the church, claiming that what they're imposing on the church is in fact the authentic Catholic faith. It's mind-numbing to wrestle with when we are talking about these things and interacting with the people who push these ideas, because they believe firmly that they are on a God-given mission to bring the church up to date, to make it more relevant in the world, that God wants them to do these things. Hand in hand with that is this idea that somewhere along the line the church has defected, perhaps in its early days. I once described this in the way that you've probably heard Protestants make the claim that in the early days the church was fine, and then bad old Constantine came along and established the Catholic Church and drove it under the real church underground. Some call this like the Babylonian captivity in reference to some events in the Old Testament. Many Protestants push this idea and claim that the Catholic Church is never been the real church, and that the true church was captured by the forces of evil. I don't know how you square that with Christ's promise to always be with the church, but that's what they push. At least some of them do. We see this in the church too, though. Since Vatican II, you've had this idea that the Catholic Church went off the rails somewhere, and that it had been captured by the very rigid, the people who imposed all these rituals, complex rituals, and kept the Bible from people, and a lot of things that sound very similar, because there are arguments that come from Protestants. They believe it's their God-given right to reestablish the church. That's why they often speak about things in the language of a new church. We see this today with the synodal church. Some of the bishops who promote synodality the most talk about or use language that is very much like they are talking about establishing a new church. This underlying idea we can just charitably call practical atheism. Cardinal Robert Sarah was giving an address this week at the NAPA Institute in the United States, and he denounces this attempt to break the church away from its glorious past and to blame the church for all sorts of evils in the world when the church is not to blame for these things. This comes from LifeSite News with this headline: Cardinal Sarah, rejection of traditional liturgy, morals are forms of practical atheism in the church. The prefect emeritus of the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments also linked the rejection of the Latin Mass with Europe's defection from Christianity. You may have noticed, in the last 60 years or so, Europe has become more and more secular, less and less Catholic, and less Christian more broadly. Cardinal Sarah is saying you can blame the liturgical reform for that. For many of you, that's a stretch, but the statistics do sort of bear that out, that you had just a lot of faithful just leave in the early 70s when the new Mass and the chaos that surrounded it was implemented. In the United States, we had John Denver Masses as one such example of this. In Europe, I'm sure they had some equivalent. But the chaos that afterwards was not of Christ. And a lot of people left. And the church also, more importantly, took a back seat to secular politics, with Pope Paul VI famously laying down the papal tiara in a sign of surrendering the church's authority on secular matters. That's the practical atheism that Cardinal Sarah is talking about. But here is the sum of what he had to say, because this is leading somewhere beyond just anti-New Mass stuff. Quote, Cardinal Robert Sarah, prefect emeritus of the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments in Rome, linked the attempted suppression and rejection of the traditional Latin Mass within the Church to the rejection of traditional Catholic morals, and Europe's wider defection from Christianity in what he called practical atheism. The comments on the attempt to cast off the Church's ancient liturgy within the Latin Rite came in a talk Cardinal Sarah offered at the Catholic University of America on Thursday, June 14th, at an event titled An Evening with Robert Cardinal Sarah, sponsored by the NAPA Institute and the Catholic Information Center in Washington, D.C. The Guinean cardinal offered Mass at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception before giving his lecture and received a standing ovation at the start and end of his remarks. The talk was titled, "The Catholic Church's Enduring Answer to the Practical Atheism of Our Age." In the speech, the cardinal lamented the rejection of God that has taken hold of much of the West, especially once Christian Europe. He said this rejection of God takes the form of not so much intellectual atheism, but a practical atheism by which modern man acts as if God does not exist or does not matter. He especially denounced the ways this practical atheism has entered even the Church, evidenced in the rejection of traditional Catholic morality, traditional Catholic doctrine, and the traditional form of Catholic liturgy. Among his other remarks on the state of the Church, the former prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship, who has long been a champion of the traditional Latin Mass and a return to a more reverent manner of celebrating the liturgy, said that the widespread attempt in the Latin Church to cast off her traditional manner of worshiping God, which the Church has seen fit to use for centuries, is a form of practical atheism in which God is no longer at the center of divine worship, but rather the sensibilities of modern man. Linking this rejection of the Church's traditional liturgy to the rejection of the Church's traditional moral theology, Sarah identified both as subtle forms of atheism, which he said is not an outright rejection of God, but it pushes God to the side. End quote. Yes, he was speaking often about the liturgy, but this is not the only place we see this in the Church today. There's everyone's favorite topic right now, deaconesses, or deaconettes as I usually call them, and the opening up of holy orders to women. The arguments underlying this are rarely based in anything even vaguely Catholic. Sometimes you see arguments going back to the ancient church, as they like to say, where there were deaconesses, who were, in reality, glorified assistants to the bishop, who would handle things that the bishop couldn't do himself, assisting female catechumens with preparing for their baptisms or handling domestic issues for the bishop as his assistant or the assistant to a presbyter. But they weren't ordained. There's no evidence historically that they were ordained. But you see this, and I'm going to give you this. This article here is incredible. It makes the argument better than I ever could. So from Commonweal magazine with this headline, "Why not women? The all-male priesthood is no small matter." There's an underlying argument that you're going to see here. And the argument is that the Church does not respect women, has never respected women, and that it's time to apply the respect that the world demands to the Church. I'm going to challenge you in this short piece we're going to go over here to find the Catholic argument. I was not able to. Maybe you can, in your charity, find a Catholic argument from what you're about to hear that I was not able to hear because you are more charitable than I am when it comes to this topic. We shall see. The article is written by somebody calling themselves Alice McDermott, who is demanding this kind of thing. And this is not a new article. This came out a couple of months ago, but I think this is relevant to what we're talking about. So from the article, quote, "Otto Preminger's film, The Cardinal, was released in 1963 when I was 10 years old, so I guess it was some years later that it appeared on TV. I recall watching it with my mother. I watched many movies with my mother. Early on, there's a scene where a young priest tells his pregnant sister's doctor that they must let her pass in order to save her unborn child. I turned to my mother in disbelief. Would that really happen? Oh yes, my mother assured me, placidly enough. That's the rule in the Catholic Church. The baby's life comes before that of the mother. Until then, I'd always pestered my mother about having another baby. I was the youngest of 3 and the only girl. I wanted a sister. But after seeing the Cardinal, I prayed she would never again take that risk. I knew I needed her far more than I needed some imagined baby sister. Her life was the life I cherished above all others, the life most essential to my own. I suppose I was too young at the time to realize that the pregnant sister who must pass someday could be me. This then was my first encounter with the diminished value my church assigns to the lives of women. Not the last, of course. In those days, I could not be an altar server, as my brothers were, simply because I was female. Throughout my grammar school years, I watched the middle-aged nuns who taught us, formidable, dignified women, bow and scrape and even giggle whenever the parish priests, some of them mere 20-somethings, deigned to visit our classrooms. In my all-girls Catholic high school, we were challenged by our female teachers to read widely, to know world history and church history, to understand economics, and not just home economics. We were encouraged to debate cogently, whether our subject was politics or poetry or Plato's cave. We were assured that the big news of the era was true. Women could become anything they set their minds to. And yet we were able to celebrate Mass or line up the reconciliation. Only the local priest agreed to fit us girls into his busy schedule. Years later, my own daughter asks Sister Nina, her 5th grade teacher, why there were 7 sacraments for Catholic men, but only 6 for Catholic women. Sister's reply, good question. End quote. You see the underlying argument in that piece? The underlying argument is, of course, the standards of the world. It's not a coincidence that she was having these experiences in the 1960s and the 1970s. Older members of this audience lived through that time and will quite understand and could attest to it in the comments if they wanted to, the social upheavals happening at that time. In fact, most of what we're seeing now in the church is that logic from that specific time period being pushed onto the church. They talk about keeping the church relevant to the modern world and that we must go through a period of permanent aggiornamento, a permanent revolution in the church or permanent cycle of change. But the ones pushing that are locked in that particular cultural space, the 1960s and the 1970s. They, of course, would want us to push it to wherever the cultural space is now. But the problem, of course, is that would be a terrible idea, and I think even most of them would agree with that, except maybe the younger revolutionaries. That's why you see the attempt to change the church teaching on the James Martin sin, because the younger ones who are pushing this stuff, who did not have that experience from that time period, they take that spirit from that time period and they have brought that up to date. And they continue to push modern changes in the church. And why is that? Because it's very simple. It goes back to what Cardinal Robert Sarah said. The church has attempted, and I don't mean the church, we'll put church in quotes here, perhaps the ape of the church, has attempted to break the Catholic Church from its glorious past, to impose something new on it. They did cause a rupture. It's obvious and plain to see. All you have to do is read the documents from that era and read what the church taught before, and you can't reconcile them. They have tried to do that. And it's good cardinals and good bishops who are quietly telling bishops behind the scenes and the laity at these kinds of conferences to resist this stuff. That will lead us back to where the church needs to be, in perfect continuity with what came before. But what we're seeing here, this deaconesses issue, is a perfect example of practical atheism. God pushed aside. His rules pushed aside. A tacit rejection that the church was founded on the rock of Peter by Jesus Christ, the second person of the most holy Trinity himself. That's what we see. Practical atheism. I'm curious what you have to say about this, so let me know in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.